Welcome to the third episode of the Jay-Z Show. I'm Zafar Sobhan, editor and publisher of Counterpoint. I'm joined by Jon Danilowicz, a longtime diplomat. He was the deputy chief of mission for the U.S. Embassy here in Bangladesh. In fact, I think that was his third tour of duty here in Dhaka, making him one of the most experienced diplomats to have served here in Bangladesh. And of course, his engagement with Bangladesh continues, and he is well known as a commentator, analyst, and friend of Bangladesh. So welcome to all of you who are tuning in. It's August 15th. Jon, good to see you again. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Great. Thanks, Zafar. It's great to see you again, and it's fun every couple of weeks to sit down and talk about Bangladesh. So today is August 15th. I remember my time in Bangladesh when my different friends would have different ways of marking today. As I joked with others, there was one group who would take me out to distribute khichdi to mark the anniversary of Sheikh Mujib's assassination. And then there was another group that was always trying to give me a piece of birthday cake to celebrate Begum Zia's birthday. So I won't ask you which you were doing today, but it makes me think about this whole issue of, I guess, hero worship in Bangladesh, and the degree to which Bangladeshi politics ends up being like sport. You have to pick a team and then support that team and its members regardless of what they do.
Well, I certainly come from Team Khichdi. I come from an old Awami League family, and certainly that is how I was raised. I remember growing up in England in the 1970s in the aftermath of the massacre of August 15, and we were raised, to think of this as a day of mourning. But of course, I understand that not all families and not all people in Bangladesh feel the same way. And I think what's important is there does need to be space for people who look at things differently. And one of the problems, as you've alluded to here in Bangladesh, is that, really we don't have that kind of nuanced understanding. You have people who will hero worship Mujib, and you have people who will demonize him and say that really he was the progenitor of everything that's gone wrong in Bangladesh. Where I think the truth is, of course, he was, he was a complex man. He did many great things. We have many things to be thankful for in terms of the birth of Bangladesh and the role he played. But certainly, he was a man who made his fair share of mistakes, who made his fair share of errors, and by no means can he be above criticism, can he be above questioning. So, that is, I think, where we are, I still find in 2025 that this is a problem we have in Bangladesh, is that we aren't able to take a nuanced view, not of Mujib, not of Ziaur Rahman, possibly not even of Professor Yunus now today. I'm not sure. What do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, to take that just a step further, we all remembered over this past several weeks the sacrifices of those who were on the front lines of the struggle last July and August. Certainly, some of their reputations have been tarnished in the ensuing months as they've transitioned from leading an uprising to, in many cases, being in government or trying to form a political party. It was always interesting for me when these debates would come up because I was an outsider. I didn't have skin in the game. But people want to put you in categories. Even as a foreigner, people want to know that you're with them. So people would always look for signs, whether it was from me or my colleagues in the diplomatic corps, that we had subscribed to one view of Bangladesh's history or another. Again, as an American, we've done a lot of soul searching in the United States about our own history, our own founding fathers. And I think it's a consensus view now that while these people achieved great things and we would not exist as a country without them, the original sin of slavery, for example, continues to taint the legacy of many of our founders. So for Bangladesh, I've often thought that one of the real challenges for moving forward is coming to grips with the history. And as you say, whether it's Mujib's legacy or those of his comrades who led the liberation struggle, but the other parties have the same. I mean, if you look at the Jamaat Islami, for example, those who were their leaders during the 1971 period, branded as war criminals by some, seen as martyrs by others. And as you allude to, even Professor Yunus, who has achieved great things to worldwide renown, but he's also not above criticism. And I think in recent days, we've seen some of that come to the fore with from some surprising quarters, actually, in my view. some very intense criticism of Professor Yunus as well.
And here's the thing, and my sense is that even if one finds the criticism founded or unfounded, whether you think it's fair or unfair, that really should be the culture we're trying to create here in Bangladesh, where, you are able to criticize whoever's in power. And like I said, and criticism may well be unfair, it may well be unfounded, but I think it is important to really have that space available. I think one of the problems we have in Bangladesh is that we typically don't have that space. If you look back, whether it's Professor Yunus now, whether it is Sheikh Hasina, Khalida Zia, and then going further back to Hussein Muhammad Irshad, Zia, Mujib, there's always been that sense that whoever's in power is above criticism. And it is interesting. I mean, on the one hand, you have the interim government who they say, please feel free, criticize us. We want you to criticize us. We welcome critique, and that's their official position. But I think it's also fairly clear that they're extraordinarily sensitive to criticism. In that sense, they're not at all different from any other sort of group we've had or political party we've had leading Bangladesh. So this is an issue. I mean, I think criticism should be part and parcel of what we do. And then you should also understand that just because you criticize, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have it in for the person. In fact, what we've always been trying to tell people is that critique and criticism is the best thing you can do for any elected leader, even for any unelected leader, because it helps them understand where people are and what people and what people think. So that culture is something I think we need to develop further. And similarly, the culture which says that, people have good sides, people have bad sides, and let's talk about it all.
No, and I mean, if you look at it again, if you look at Bangladesh's political history, the reality is, despite these, cults of personality, the hero worship, it's not ended well for any of the leaders of Bangladesh. I mean, certainly Mujib's assassination in 1975, along with his family members, was horrific. If you look at the end that Zia Rahman faced, was, again, not just his eventual death, but the numbers of coups that he faced. Again, maybe President Ershad got off relatively lightly with his short stints in prison. But no leader in Bangladesh seems to get off scot-free. So one has to think about whether there are ways to avoid this outcome so that political competition doesn't have to be, again, the zero-sum winner-take-all. So the stakes are so high that people are unwilling to even countenance the idea of giving up power.
And I mean, I think that's what we've seen, isn't it, over the last couple of decades. And that's really what has underpinned the rising autocracy of the Awami League over the last 15 years, is that at some point, and even right from the start, they, if you were to talk to people in the Awami League, they'd say, well, we can't afford to be out of power, because if we're out of power, we're just going to be, completely wiped off the face of the earth. And it's interesting to note that that did not happen. I mean, for instance, there were people saying that, well, if the Awami League ever steps downwards or ever forced from power, that there's going to be a massive bloodbath. And I think it's noteworthy that there wasn't any such thing. I mean, certainly there have been revenge killings and isolated incidents, but nothing like what had been feared or what had been prognosticated by the Awami League when they were having these discussions in the last 15 years or so. But I mean, I think this is it. What we need to do is we need to create this culture, where people are neither heroes nor villains, where if you're in power, you don't have all the power, and if you're out of power, you don't, you're not vulnerable, you're not in the crosshairs, you're not targeted. And I'm not sure, if we, and again, I think one of the things we're seeing is that people imagine that the fix to this is that, you can somehow, to fix the Constitution and put something in law which will change things. I don't know if that really is the solution so much as I think the solution has to come from inside both the people who practice politics and also the rest of us, your average Bangladeshi. My sense has always been that I think the events of July and August last year have changed Bangladesh. I think they've changed Bangladesh forever. I strongly believe, I don't think we're ever going to go back to the situation that pertained over the last 15 years, and in many ways over the last 52 years. I really believe Bangladesh has changed. I think Bangladeshis have changed fundamentally for the better. In any party who comes to power, people are talking about, well, if the BNP comes to power with a big majority, what is going to restrain them? There's a lot of anxiety in certain circles. My sense is whoever comes to power, and it's looking like it may well be the BNP, and they may well have a sizable majority. Because of the events of last year, I think they'll have taken the lesson that you can no longer rule Bangladesh the way it had been ruled in the past, that you really need to pay attention to what the people think, what the people say, and really lead and govern with their consent. And of course, that's what democracy is meant to be. Democracy is meant to be, rule and government with the consent of the people. Of course, what we've seen in the past is that consent has been fairly limited, but I think that is going to change. That's my sense.
No, obviously. And while we're talking about Bangladesh, I'm also not ignorant to the fact that, many of the things we're talking about could also be said about the United States these days, where our own politics have become much more polarized, where, again, personalization of politics is certainly a thing. People talk about cults within the US political system, this culture of being able to disagree with the leader of the party, even for elected officials, is something that, again, has certainly changed in my own lifetime. And, as a career bureaucrat, a career civil servant, I've noticed how our civil service and bureaucracy have also become politicized. So again, none of these issues are unique to Bangladesh. I guess a couple questions I would have, going forward is, what the role of social media is in either helping make this better or, again, helping to further polarize. And then something I've also thought about a lot, both within my own country and Bangladesh, is how do you, for example, look at the education system in a country, and how do you influence perceptions of younger people as they're coming up? Because ultimately, any change has to start from the beginning. It has to start with younger people. So I don't know what your sense is in terms of, kind of longer term prospects and how, younger people are thinking about some of these issues.
No, it is fascinating. We've always sort of looked at, countries with more mature democracies, like let's say the US and Europe, and we've imagined that in time, in the fullness of time, Bangladesh is a young country, Bangladesh is a young democracy, we will move towards a more mature understanding of our political rights and how elections are operational. Of course, it seems to be going in the opposite direction. Rather than Bangladesh becoming more like America, in politically, America is becoming more like Bangladesh. I remember there was a time in America where you had mavericks in each of the political parties. You had people who would break rank with their party on this issue or that issue, and you couldn't really tell just by someone being a Democrat or a Republican what their vote would be on one particular issue. And you had right-wing Democrats and you had more liberal Republicans on this issue and that issue. But now, of course, it has become very polarized, and of course, this is something one sees all over Western Europe, and I suspect all over the world. I do think that these things are a pendulum, and they kind of swing back and forth, and so I'm hopeful that that this is not going to be baked in. What was that last question you had? I kind of lost my train of thought. You had a very specific one for me. I had an answer for it.
Sure. No, it was about young people and young people's perceptions of this and how generational change fits into this equation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the first thing I'd say is I think that one of the things which I think is really important for Bangladesh is to okay, yeah. Yes, young people. I think one of the things which we'd really been hoping for after the uprising of August and July last year was that we'd really move forward and look forward rather than look backwards. And one of the things which was disappointing about the rhetoric which came in the months immediately after the uprising was that there was a lot of looking backwards. We thought that, a lot of relitigating the issues of 1971, relitigating the issues of 1972 to 75, relitigating the issues of the role of Sheikh Mujib and all of these things in the constitution. And I always thought that we would be better off if we tried to just move forward and look forward rather than move forward and look back. And I would hope that the younger generation would, in fact, say, you know, something, let's draw a line under all of these arguments and discussions and debates and disputes, which have been bedeviling Bangladesh for the last 50 years. And I think, you know, maybe that took a little while to come, but hopefully moving forward, certainly after the upcoming elections, we will see people say, you know something, what's more important is to focus on the future rather than focus on the past. And let's not have our political identity dictated or defined by what your position is on this issue or that issue, and see if we can come to agreements and see if we can have alliances and friendships and which cross party lines and in fact cross belief systems. So it's perfectly okay for people to believe different things about different periods in our history, and we should be able to learn how to live with that. So that's my hope. And as I said initially, it didn't seem to be, we started that way, but then my sense is that as we go on, maybe it will be more that way in the future. Let's see. Let's hope anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, and I'm not there in Dhaka, so I see everything through the lens or the filter of being thousands of miles away. And I'm limited in some extent to what the chattering classes are talking about. So a lot of these issues are very frequent in the circles in which we run. But then at the same time, we see from time to time these public opinion polls that come out and show that, not surprisingly, people care about bread and butter issues. Again, even if you look to why events unfolded the way they did last July and
Yeah,
August, there were political grievances, but underlying those were some very serious economic concerns, particularly
I
among
think
young people.
absolutely. Yeah.
So that'll be, I think, an interesting question as we get into campaigning season. Do the parties actually talk about these issues that resonate with voters, and then to what extent do they feel obligated to deliver on those? And will we have discussions about those issues more related to the future rather than these headline grabbing issues, which ultimately don't really affect people's day to day lives?
No, I mean, I think if you look at opinion polling, and I've been involved in this for several decades now in Bangladesh, and maybe this is true everywhere in the world, people in Bangladesh really care only about two things. They care about the price of food and they care about law and order. And that's about it. Poll after poll after poll has shown this, and you're absolutely right. The subtext, the underlying subtext of the uprising last year was economic insecurity. And, you know, I think in the end, when the end came, it came is a surprise. No one thought that the government would fall quite so quickly. But I think after the middle of July, there were many people I was speaking to who thought that, you know, even if the government managed to survive this particular uprising, that there would be more coming, because we also understood the tremendously poor situation the economy was in, and we thought that that was going to provide an impetus to actually, this was something which the Awami League government would not be able to resolve or solve. And so certainly we shouldn't discount that. I think when it comes to these sort of historical questions, I think, as you say, among the chattering classes or the political classes or the type of people who are more active politically, you know, they do care, I suppose, to some extent, you know, about this narrative and that narrative. But I think your average Bangladeshi doesn't care at all. My understanding of the average Bangladeshi is that, you know, so for instance, for your hardcore Awami Leaguer, there is, you know, there's a list of things that you're supposed to believe in, you know, and if you're a hardcore BNP, there's a certain list of things you're supposed to believe in terms of, you know, Zia Rahman on this side, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman on the other. And I think most Bangladeshis, okay, you know, if you're talking about your average Bangladeshi who has no real strong political instinct one way or the other, they may vote for one party predominantly over the other, but they tend to have a good opinion of both these leaders, and they tend to have a good opinion of people like Maulana Bhashani and other political leaders. They don't at all subscribe to the, you know, one side must be good, one side must be bad point of view, which you see among people who are more politicized. You see, I think that's very much that is very much restricted to a very narrow band of Bangladeshis. And maybe, of course, you say it's probably the narrow band of Bangladeshis you and I know the most and speak to the most. But we should never forget that that doesn't necessarily represent the entire country, and that the vast majority of Bangladeshis, I think, to the extent that they think about these things at all, and I think you're right, probably for the large majority, they don't ever think about them. But to the extent that they do, I think they like to think, they want to think well. They want to think well of people who are seen as great figures in history. You alluded to the checkered history of America's founding fathers. And I think, again, I mean, you have some people who are very strongly critical, and they say, well, we need to remove their names from schools and parks and everything. But I think most Americans, sort of occupy a middle ground. They think that, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, these were great people. Certainly they had feet of clay. Certainly they had many, many sins of which they were guilty, but they would like to look at the entirety of the person and not consign them to the dustbin of history because of, whatever faults they may have had. And they had considerable faults, and no one is doubting that. And I think that's generally how most people like to look at historical figures.
So, thinking about all this and thinking about Bangladesh and looking forward to elections and campaigning, it seems that there's a real challenge for the Students' Party in particular, because their real appeal is the role that they played last summer. And again, that's
Yeah.
done in contradistinction to the role of the Awami League and Sheikh Hasina.
Sure.
Yet I wonder how far that gets you with voters. If you're a voter and you're looking at your future and you're looking at these bread and butter issues, then your question is going to be who's best able to deliver that. And the students, by
Yes.
definition, don't have a track record. They don't have much to point to. So it makes you wonder that in an electoral sense, how far can they take that appeal and what their strategy should be going forward if their interest is in influencing Bangladesh and influencing the country's future direction. It almost as if they have to make that leap from talking again about the past and what happened last summer to putting forward a compelling vision for the future. And I don't know, frankly, if they're there yet.
Well, in fairness, it does take a lot of time. It's been literally 12 months, and I think very few political parties anywhere in the world can articulate a vision and put together a program within such a short period of time. I think what the students need to do is they need to understand that they do have an enormous amount of goodwill among many people in Bangladesh, and that they really need to kind of be in this for the long haul. There is a lot of dissatisfaction among the voting public for the existing choices we have in Bangladesh. A lot of people look to the Awami League and they look to the BNP and they think, well, look, they've had their chance and they've really not delivered to the extent that we wanted them to deliver. There have been corruption, there has been extortion, there has been misgovernance, malgovernance on both sides. So there is certainly room and space for a new political dispensation. But these things take time. They absolutely don't happen overnight. So I think for the student party, they really need to be in this for the long haul. And I think here they can actually take a leaf out of the Jamaat's book, because, the Jamaat have been hoeing a lonely row for 5 decades now in Bangladesh, and prior to that, and it's taken them a long time. It's taken them a long time to, I think current polling shows them in a better situation than they have been in history, but it hasn't always been this way. And so these things actually do take time to win people's trust. And if you look at elsewhere in the subcontinent, look at Imran Khan's party in Pakistan. It took about 20 years, if I'm not wrong, to really put together sort of a governing plurality. These things take time. You cannot expect anything to happen overnight. So my advice to the student party would be to carry on, do articulate a vision for the future, do continue to define who you are in contradiction, in distinction to the other political parties, show how you're different, but also be patient. Understand that this isn't going to happen in one day. I don't think anyone is expecting them to do anything great in the upcoming elections, but it's important to understand that that should not be taken as a defeat. That should not be taken as a failure. The fact that they've been able to put together a political party, if they can put together 300 candidates in 300 constituencies, these are great things. These are things which they should be proud of. And I think that would augur very well for the future. And again, if they can be part of creating this new political culture where you actually have time and space to grow, I think, perhaps their fear is that, well, if we're again in the opposition, we'll be wiped away in a new flood of oppression and repression like we saw in the past. But I think part of the goal is to accept the fact that we will be in the opposition, but to then strengthen that role of the opposition. And of course, that is what they have accomplished. I think their bravery and courage of last year has in fact changed things and created that space such that even if they are in the opposition, they can still do much more with that space and have that space to grow in a way they did not perhaps in the past.
No, I mean that's interesting. For me, as I've been looking at Bangladesh, it does seem that we're in a bit of the doldrums right now. There was a huge anticipation about the announcement of the election date and what was happening with the July Declaration, the July Charter. That was all announced by Professor Yunus as anticipated on the anniversary. We're still waiting for the Election Commission to declare the schedule. Word out of London is that Tariq Rahman is planning to return as anticipated closer towards the beginning of the campaign, so toward the end of this year. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over this next 2 or 3 month period. There's a risk that we're just in this holding pattern, as it were, before the campaign starts, before candidates are selected, before that political activity ramps up. Meanwhile, the interim government increasingly, I think, becomes a lame duck. I mean, Professor Yunus just had a visit to Malaysia, in which he seemingly did some meaningful things, didn't get a lot of attention. Next month, he'll be coming to New York. Certainly, it won't have the fanfare and the buzz that he had last year, having arrived, just having taken this position and having the international community kind of line up at his doorstep. So it'll be interesting to see, how he adjusts as well and how the interim government adjusts, and to the extent to which they also see themselves now as in that final chapter. And then the issues related to transition. So my guess is that over this next couple months period, we'll have a lot of maybe smoke, but not a lot of fire.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's it. And I would say that not lame duck so much as, I think perhaps we had slightly too unrealistic expectations of the interim government in the first game. We forgot to a certain extent that it was and is a transitional government. And I think what they really need to do now is they need to essentially, work out a sort of a soft landing for themselves. How are they going to, move from point A to point B? We've got a sort of a 5 or 6 months, let's say, between now and the end of the their term when the election's happening. And I think if they manage it well, no one is expecting them to do anything huge between now and then. But really, if they're able to govern well for the next few months and able to ensure a free and fair election, this would be a good thing. And then I think that being the case, if that really is their legacy, that they can really, go back to their day jobs, feeling that they have done something very profound, that they have done something very estimable, and that they have really performed well for the Bangladeshi people. I don't think they need to be doing anything more than they're doing right now. And I think for most of us, we'd actually welcome them really now focusing just on, like you said, bread and butter issues in the elections. And I think that's absolutely fine. But I do think it's important for them to all get on this page in the last 5 or 6 months and say that this is what we want to accomplish. And doing that, I think they really can deliver. And people will perhaps look back at the government with a fair amount of respect and a fair amount of admiration.
Of course, the conspiracy theories continue. You still hear that several of the advisors and others may still be plotting to frustrate elections, which again, I find no evidence of, but that conspiracy theory still swirls away. And then to your earlier point as well, it's interesting to think about how the advisors and those in this government will fare after the transition. I mean, we think back to the 2007-8 period. In the immediate aftermath, several of the key figures in that government ended up leaving Bangladesh, in some cases never to return. Others remained but adopted very low profiles, and you don't really hear from them that much, with one or two exceptions. The press secretary of the current government often thinks about loud about his future and what he's going to do afterwards. I'm sure others are thinking as well. But I think, again, in terms of looking at Bangladesh and its political transition, if the caretaker government mechanism has returned to stay, then I think there has to be some thought to not just how individuals approach this interim role or this transition role, but what they can expect after the fact. Because 5 years hence, the government will be again recruiting a set of advisors to come in. And if I were approached for such a position, I'd have to think twice about what the personal cost of this would be for me. As much as I might be able to achieve or have ideas, you never want to leave a situation in a worse position than you started. And of course, this is a big question for Professor Yunus. I'm sure he's been thinking about what he's going to do next. Not that he did this for his own legacy. I mean, he certainly had enough laurels to rest on, but he'll also have to think about what his legacy will be after this period is over.
Absolutely. I mean, I think for him it's an easier question because, as you said, he is an international figure of global stature. There's plenty he could go on to continue to do. I think it's a more nuanced position for other people in his cabinet. We did have seen some very unfortunate incidents. So if you look at the treatment of the former Chief Justice, Khairul Haq, for instance, that has, what we're hoping is that even people who are in power now today, that when the worm turns, that they won't themselves again find themselves vulnerable. And I really think that is something which is again important for all of us to work together and kind of help create that culture. And again, I think it's important for the interim government because it's its own, soon enough, 6 months from now, they're going to be the ones who are out of power. So if they can take steps between now and then to really show that they are a little bit different from the administrations which have come before them, then maybe they too will be afforded a certain level of grace, a certain soft landing, which others in the past have not. And I think that is so important. So I really think the main thing which we all need to do, starting with the interim government, but also the political parties, and my sense is that they are, to a large extent, amenable to this idea, is to really just lower the temperature on the political conversation here in Bangladesh. Make it not winner take all. Make it so that you can live to fight another day. That, more than anything, is the most important thing that can really be accomplished in the 6 months or 8 months or however long it's going to be that the IG has left. On that note, I think we are out of time. As always, I wish we had more time to have this conversation, but it's been good. I look forward to speaking with you again a couple of weeks from now. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. I hope you're finding these as interesting and as much fun as John and I are having. And John, any final words?
No, it was great talking again, and look forward to catching up in a couple of weeks.
Sounds good. All right, then. Bye-bye, everyone.